Hello there, I'm Andrew Linnane, and you're very welcome to the first edition of Film Network Ireland's One Take Review. So, in One Take Review, we're basically going to take apart and put back together again a recent cinema release, and we're going to do it in one take, uh, basically because we're not at the stage where we can afford clips or fancy visuals yet. So, we're going to do it just talking. It could be a long take or it could be a short take. It depends on the film itself. Today it's likely to be a longish enough take because we're going to look at Denis Villeneuve's Dune. And we're going to have a look at the sort of tangled history of how Dune has finally made it to the screen before we get to the film itself. So Frank Herbert's Dune was first published in 1965, so it found a ready audience among hippies who had gradually worn out their dog-eared copies of The Lord of the Rings. It was instantly recognized as a science fiction classic, and immediately Hollywood was kind of interested. And the rights were first bought in 1972. First director who was touted to handle Dune was David Lean, which actually makes quite a lot of sense because Dune is quite like Lawrence of Arabia, except just with sandworms. So unfortunately, that version of Dune didn't quite see the light of day. But things start to get interesting in 1974. So a French producer approaches the Chilean director Alejandro Jodorowsky. He said, well, what movie would you like to make next? And Jodorowsky wants to make Dune. So Jodorowsky directed the very famous Western or anti-Western El Topo, where basically he took the trappings of a spaghetti Western and kind of basically turned it into a psychedelic spiritual odyssey. Following that, he made The Holy Mountain, in which he didn't bother taking the trappings of any other type of movie. He just made a psychedelic spiritual odyssey. Any other decade, you would find it hard to get funding for these type of movies over and over again, but it is the 1970s. So basically, Jodorowsky had his opportunity to make Dune, and so began the pre-production process for the most amazing film which was never made. Jodorowsky begins to assemble an incredible creative team. He gets for set design and costume design, he gets the brilliant French cartoonist Mobius. He gets H.R. Geiger, Dan O'Bannon as a supervisor for special effects. So both of those obviously will go on to work on Alien with Ridley Scott. So an amazing kind of design team. For the soundtrack, he wants Pink Floyd. I think they've agreed to do it. And in terms of the cast, his ambitions are even grander. He has David Carradine, he has Mick Jagger, he has Orson Welles, and not to typecast Orson Welles too much, but I think that's probably for Baron Harkonnen. Apparently he offered him the role, and Welles said, well, I'm not really that interested in doing it. So they're sitting in a restaurant, and Jodorowsky says, look, I'm going to get this chef onto the set. This is how you're going to eat every day. So Welles says, I'll do it. And then I guess drinks back some of Paul Masson's finest. So he's got an amazing cast there. For the Emperor, he decides to approach Salvatore Dali. Salvatore Dali, who I don't think has been in a movie at this point, says, well, I want to be the highest paid movie actor ever. He demands $100,000 per hour. Now, apparently then Jodorowsky said, well, I'll give you $100,000 per minute, which doesn't seem like tough negotiating to me. But obviously this is all, all the pieces are put in place for a movie that will be, I don't know, more of a religious experience, more of a psychedelic trip than an actual movie itself. And there's no doubt that had this movie been made, it probably would have been the most amazing science fiction movie ever. But I mean, one of the problems with Dune, which has haunted Dune throughout its life being adapted, is it's a vast story. It's a very complicated story. So Jodorowsky has written a script which is about the size of a telephone directory, and when the producers approach him, they kind of go, okay, you can knock this out of the park in maybe 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours. Jodorowsky just goes, no, there's going to be at least 10 to 15 hours. So at that point, the guys who were signing the checks got a bit nervous and they decided to stop signing the checks. So sadly, that Jodorowsky's Dune is not to be. But 1980, Dino De Laurentiis, the great Italian producer who had also produced a kind of out there science fiction film in Mike Hodges' Flash Gordon. So he wants to make Dune. And first of all, he approaches Ridley Scott, which is really a perfect match for the material. Scott has just made Alien, so no one could be a better choice to do it. Scott is initially very enthusiastic about doing it, but then sadly his older brother passes away and he feels that he cannot at this point commit himself to such a big project. So De Laurentiis is still hungry to bring Dune to the screen. He next approaches a young, kind of up and coming filmmaker called David Lynch. Now, this is a very strange sort of point in David Lynch's career. We all know David Lynch's identity very well as a filmmaker, and in a way he kind of created his own genre. But at this point, it's very early in his career. He has made his debut Eraserhead, which is a very unconventional and a very abstract film, but it was so good that it kind of put him on the map. And then in The Elephant Man, he found a movie that was sort of halfway between his kind of surreal sensibilities and a more sort of mainstream or commercial sensibility. So at this point, it looks like Lynch is thinking of actually becoming a mainstream filmmaker, and he has actually met George Lucas, which seems amazing now, but George Lucas wants Lynch to direct Return of the Jedi. I mean, it does seem amazing, but on the other hand, who hasn't watched Eraserhead and thought to themselves, this guy should direct Return of the Jedi? Or who didn't watch Blue Velvet and think to themselves, I'd love to see what this director could do with Ewoks? And anyway, Lynch's Return of the Jedi was not to be, but he did decide to do Dune. And David Lynch's Dune was kind of doomed from the beginning for a couple of reasons. Number one, the studio really expected to get a big pop culture phenomenon like Star Wars. And they'd actually produced a line of children's toys, the only time, as far as I know, in association with a David Lynch film that children's toys were produced. Also coloring books, the whole works. They really wanted a big Star Wars phenomenon. But the problem was that the novel Dune itself and the director David Lynch were just not amenable to something like Star Wars. Dune, which Star Wars borrowed a lot from, is nevertheless a much more kind of adult, a much more ambiguous, a much darker version of the hero's journey. It was never exactly going to be that thing. And Lynch himself, obviously, is not the most commercially accessible director either. The big problem for this movie was basically down to the problem we've already mentioned, the problem of Dune's vast sort of scope and scale. They wanted Lynch to tell the story in a 2-hour movie, which wound up with a film which was very narratively confused and very confusing. So audiences were baffled, basically. Critics didn't like the movie, and it kind of flopped, even though its design aesthetic had a kind of a lasting influence. So that nearly brings us to 2021 and to Villeneuve's Dune. There is another version in the meantime. The Sci-Fi Channel do a television adaptation, which they call Frank Herbert's Dune, so as not to be confused with James Joyce's sprawling sci-fi epic of the same name. Sadly, this is the one that's going to be forgotten. It's apparently a very decent adaptation of the novel, but the Sci-Fi Channel didn't really have the budget for a very strong visual aesthetic, so it's the one that we tend to forget. So now we have Villeneuve's version. And I think one of his main ambitions in making this movie was not to fall into the same trap that Lynch's version had and that had haunted previous versions of the movie, and that is not to get weighed down trying to tell too vast a story in kind of too short screen time. So wisely, Villeneuve has split the movie into two, and he's taking his time. He's telling the story very methodically and slowly. He has also expanded somewhat on the feeling of scope in the Lynch movie, so using all the benefits of a huge budget and contemporary technology, he's given the Dune universe a much greater sense of kind of scope. And there's nothing individual component of the movie which you couldn't say was excellent. I mean, the casting is brilliant. The cast are all very, very good. The design is, as you'd expect, very, very strong. With Villeneuve, not surprisingly, the design aesthetic is very strong. The sound design, very good. It's a very good blockbuster movie. It's very, very entertaining, very impressive, very grand. There's nothing really wrong with it you could point out to. Except one thing I would say slightly, Hans Zimmer. I've always had mixed feelings about Hans Zimmer. And I feel I can say this because I think he's not going to be too upset by anything that I say. He's regarded as kind of a master of modern film scoring. Um, I I would have mixed feelings about him. I wouldn't have put him. I wouldn't put him in the same category as a Morricone or a Bernard Herrmann or perhaps even a John Barry. I think that when he is in a quieter, more melodic mode or more immersive, I kind of like him. But he has a tendency towards bombast when he's a bit louder, and especially if you put him together with Christopher Nolan, whom I call Mr. Boombastic. Uh, the two of them together, it results in a kind of an assault on the eardrums. So some of his music sounds to me too conventional, too film score like. So I wasn't hugely gone on his score. But again, that is a minor point because a lot of it I did like. I think the main question to ask in relation to this version of Dune is there's no doubt that it is a very, very good film, but is it an extraordinary film? Is it an amazing film? Is it a classic? That's the question that you need to ask. And movies which have become sci-fi classics in the past, like Alien or like Blade Runner or 2001, they do so in a way because they surprise us. They show us something completely new, something that we weren't expecting. Whereas what I would wonder with this version of Dune, is it just a case of something that's maybe a little bit familiar, done very, very well, but nothing particularly exceptional or new? One thing I felt that it was missing was a sense of the kind of alienness or otherworldliness or weirdness of Dune's world. And that you got in David Lynch's version despite its flaws. So it may be, I think, that Lynch's version fails in ways that are very memorable and very distinctive, whereas Villeneuve's version is perhaps succeeds in ways that are a little bit sterile. But that may be unfair. It may be that this is leading up to something which is quite spectacular in the sequel. It's perhaps too early to say. But definitely, on a first viewing, I didn't find it quite as interesting or engaging as his Blade Runner film. So I guess it remains to be seen. But I would recommend it to anyone to see. As I've said, I do think that it is, by the standard of our current blockbusters, a fantastic film. And one last thing before we finish up, I would like to review the film going experience, which we may not always do in one take reviews. One thing that I think we should draw attention to, and I do hate to complain, I'm not generally a complainer, but it is a significant thing. I saw Dune in Cineworld on Parnell Street, and to be fair, the staff were lovely and very courteous, and the building itself was its usual aesthetically ravishing self, so there's no complaints there. That was all good. But in the screening itself, when the trailers came on, the lights were still on. Now, I think you should turn off the lights for the trailers, but it's not a cardinal sin. I'd be prepared to let that go. But then we got to the Irish Certification Board stamp for Dune. The lights are still on. At this point, you're getting a bit worried. Then the studio card comes on. The lights are still on. Now we're on the highway to the danger zone. It's definitely something is wrong. Then the movie starts and the screen is mushy. You can't see what's happening. The lights are still on. So it eventually got to the stage of 2 minutes into the movie. I had to run out, grab a guy and say, turn off the lights in screen 7 because the movie has started. Now, again, I don't like to complain, but you've got two jobs to do. You stick on the movie and you dim the lights. Full marks for the first part of that. You did indeed stick on the movie, but didn't dim the lights. So I don't know, is this an extremist position to advance? But I do think we need to make cinema theatres dark again. Anyway, that's all for now, folks. Thank you very much for watching. If you would like to find out more about Film Network Ireland, please check us out at wearefni.com. If you have your own opinions about the new Dune or Lynch's Dune or anything at all, just let us know in the comments. And until the next time, take care of yourselves.